Hi everyone, I hope you're all doing well. So my presentation for LABMP 590 will be about the evolution of the beauty industry and beauty advertising in the onset of the digital age. So I put some questions here for you to think about while I go through this presentation. So first, how has beauty advertising reflected and enforced social hegemony in the past? Second, how does it continue to impact us today in the advent of social media? And finally, how might beauty standards evolve as we approach the technological singularity? And just a quick summary of what I'll be going over in this presentation. First, I'll provide some background about the concept of beauty advertising itself. Then I'll go through the birth of influencer culture in the advent of social media. Third, I'll be looking at how AI has impacted beauty and plastic surgery. And finally, I'll be looking at how beauty might look like in the age of transhumanism. One of the first recorded use of advertisement for a cosmetic product in America was for Ivory Soap in 1882, and that's just what's pictured in the image on the left. And cosmetic products as we know it in the form of makeup weren't really available to the common populace, so the primary message that was being conveyed by these advertisements were pertaining to hygiene and cleanliness. However, if one were to consider the historical context of what was going on in America in the 1800s, one could see an underlying connotation with this association of cleanliness with goodness. So I thought this pear soap advertisement from the UK in the early 1900s pretty well reflected what I was saying in the last slide. So if you look at it, essentially there are these two small children, and the white child is bathing the black child in a bathtub. And the message inscribed on the bathtub says, "Matchless for the complexion." And then if you look at the bottom, one can see that after being cleaned, the black child has his skin completely lightened. So this is essentially saying that black skin is inherently dirty, which is reflective of the racist ideology that was surrounded in the Western world at the time and still today. So the next sort of milestone that arose in the field of beauty advertisement came in the popularity of Hollywood movies in the 1920s. And essentially, Pancake Makeup was adapted for starlets on stage into products for the mass consumer populace. And these were actually advertised to the public using celebrity endorsements, such as in this advertisement to the left, depicting popular Hollywood starlet Ella Raines. And it's important to note that most of the starlets at this time were all white. So this is the beginning of a cultural reinforcement of an ideal beauty that's associated with Eurocentric beauty standards. So these standards of an ideal beauty were also reflected in the nature of the products being advertised themselves. For example, this Natanola bleaching cream, you can see in the advertisement it says, "He used to duck me, now he dates me." So this is essentially implying that a woman with darker skin is someone to inherently be avoided at the time. And it's quite interesting to note that this product actually still exists, although it has been rebranded to be a spotlighting cream instead of an overall skin bleaching cream. And the popularity of American media, Hollywood movies, as well as beauty magazines that originate in the Western world and then are popularized elsewhere, um, results in a spread of this cultural ideology of an ideal standard of beauty that is often very white. So just an example of what I mean, these are two advertisements that were shown in India. The one on the left came from the 1940s and 50s, and you can see how it's a skin bleaching cream called Afghan Snow, and it's associating this flawless look with whiter skin. And this message is still carried forth many, many years later in this kind of modern advertisement, advertising this bleaching cream called Fair and Lovely, which is still very popular today and still very commonly used. So you can see how pervasive these colorist and Eurocentric beauty ideals are and how they've continued to disseminate throughout the decades. So another really pervasive message being spread by these advertisements is the ideal that aging is something to be avoided like the plague and should be fought essentially. And in part, this came about due to the improvements in technologies in both dermatology and cosmetics that would allow one to actually reduce the signs of wrinkles through chemistry. And so this essentially brought forth the ideal that you can actually fight back aging and that you should and one must. Something else brought on by the increased medicalization of beauty was the ever increasing popularity of cosmetic procedures. So, some statistics: the American Society of Plastic Surgery reported a 966% increase in cosmetic procedures performed during between 1992 and 2007. And notably, as the time increases and technologies improve, especially in the form of non-invasive surgeries, so more like injectable stuff such as botulinum toxin A and hyaluronic acid fillers. The number of these injectable procedures to reverse signs of aging were increased by 845% from 2000 to 2017, mostly in part due to the message being imposed by these advertising and beauty standards that one should do anything possible to prevent aging. So the background I provided is supposed to give you an idea of how beauty advertising um, essentially reinforces a kind of cultural ideal beauty that's incredibly Eurocentric. It also enforces the idea that aging is something to be combated in women, despite it being incredibly natural. And finally, how these two pressures can essentially bolster another completely lucrative and almost unnecessary industry such as cosmetic surgery. So, in the advent of social media platforms such as YouTube or Instagram, this essentially brought the birth of a new kind of endorser of beauty products that's not just the celebrity, and essentially a democratization of beauty advertising. And this would be in the form of an influencer, which is defined as an independent third party endorser who shapes audience attitudes and creates content promoting certain brands to gain a following and brand recognition. And just to kind of show you how pervasive this is and how lucrative of a career this is, essentially anyone who can get over 1 million followers on Instagram, which, while not completely common, is still achieved by over 3,600 people as of 2018, can earn upwards, if not even more, than $25,000 for a company for posting one single picture advertising a product that's usually a cosmetic or some kind of diet tool. And while it might kind of seem absurd to give someone $25,000 to just post one picture, you really can't underestimate the extreme selling power that a popular influencer can have. So, a really interesting example I have is this guy named Li Jiaqi, or also known as the Lipstick King in China, who is this beauty blogger with over 40 million followers on this Chinese app called Douyin. And essentially, there's this thing called November 11th called Singles Day in China. It's basically the largest shopping day of the year. It's kind of akin to our Boxing Day. And essentially, this guy posted a live stream of him just trying on lipsticks that were sent to him by companies. And essentially, this spurred over $145 million in lipstick sales alone on this popular Chinese shopping site Taobao in just one day. So it's important to note that a lot of the ways that these influencers gain a following is in particular due to their beauty or attractiveness. So evidently, to maintain such a large following, they're meant to constantly portray an attractive online presence, whether it be the truth or not. And so to do so, there are many apps available that can kind of edit pictures. Some of the most popular enlist the help of um, machine learning and facial recognition technology to alter the user's face in real time in photo and video. And one of the first most popular options available for people is Snapchat. So, just to kind of give you an idea of how these apps use machine learning, Snapchat filters in particular use computer vision and machine learning to essentially create a 3D space from flat image data. And then the machine is trained using a bunch of faces to create a pyramidal representation of the face based on average ratios of the facial features of the stuff it's being trained on. And this is through a process called image processing. And finally, they use something called the Viola Jones Object Detection Framework, and it essentially detects specific facial landmarks in real time using these kind of simple blocks. So this allows for the filter to be displayed on the face in real time very quickly, so the user can move around or film video without the filter being distorted. And so a picture on the left is just an example. Here we have Kim Kardashian and Kylie Jenner, who each have over 150 million followers on Instagram. using such an example of a beautifying filter on Snapchat. So you can see their skin's very smoothed, their skin tone is kind of bronzed, their eyes are enlarged and kind of sparkly. So this is just an example of what a Snapchat filter can do with the click of a button. So another use of AI in these beautifying apps can be found in the popular Chinese photo editing application called Meitu. It actually means beautiful picture in Chinese, and it's been installed in over 1 billion phones across the world and also processes about 6 billion selfies a month. So essentially, this allows the user to tweak their pictures in any way they want. They can make the eyes bigger, they can slim the jaw, they can even lengthen the legs in a full body picture. But what's really interesting is its auto beautification feature. So essentially, it uses a machine learning algorithm to look at how its users tweak and edit the photos. So it can kind of gain an understanding or a concept of beauty, or more importantly, how their user base specifically views themselves as their most beautiful. And so Meitu then compiles all this data, and they can actually refine Meitu's auto beautification feature so that at the click of the button, it can automatically put all these presets onto one user's selfie, so it can instantly make their nose thinner, their skin whiter, and their eyes bigger. However, this auto beautification figure has kind of come into contention for a lot of people due to a pattern being noticed that essentially all the tweaks that it's making are adhering to a Eurocentric beauty standard. So this can kind of be illustrated in a comedic way as if you look at the left, someone ran a picture of Kanye West through Meitu's auto beautification figure. And here you can see that his skin is much paler, kind of gray, his eyes are blue, his nose is thinner, and also his lips are smaller. So you can see how they've kind of converged his face into more of a Eurocentric beauty standard. And what's really interesting is that um, someone mentions that as Meitu's algorithm gets smarter, um, one must wonder if the user is still training Meitu or if the machine itself is training the individual, because essentially the app creates a cyclical kind of reinforcement of societal beauty standards because its user base is obviously impacted by these messages in society of how you should look. So then they use Meitu to essentially make these tweaks to conform themselves to this ideal. And then Meitu um, recognizes these tweaks and then kind of in its language converts that into the machine's definition, quote unquote, of beauty, and then applies it onto the user in just a click of a button, further reinforcing these beauty standards. So it's really interesting to see how beauty apps can kind of further disseminate and enforce these standards. There's another photo editing app that was actually mostly for entertainment rather than something distinctly meant to make your selfies look prettier. And this was really popular a while back. It's an app called FaceApp. So it actually uses a neural network to alter a user's selfie in a photorealistic manner. So I have some examples coming later, but what I wanted to address first was its hotness feature, which kind of suffers the same problem as Meitu's. So once again, you can see this tweet. He applied this hotness filter, which just takes one click of the button, and it essentially lightened his skin into this kind of gray pallor, and it also kind of brightened the eyes and made the nose smaller. So you can see how FaceApp's definition of hotness aligns with Eurocentric beauty standards. And one must wonder why, right? Because it's a machine, it technically shouldn't have any bias. However, that's clearly proven untrue when you think about how the data it's being fed, or essentially just the faces it's being fed by whoever's training the AI, is entrenched in historical biases reflecting conventional ideals of beauty. So the reason I bring up FaceApp specifically is for its other bevy of interesting features. So as you can see in the image on the left, it can actually add a pretty photorealistic smile onto an image where someone isn't smiling. It can make them look older, it can make them look younger, it can apply makeup, it can even change your hairstyle, and it actually looks quite seamless, although obviously it's not perfect. So even though this kind of technology in a widespread, free, and easy to use form is kind of in its infancy, it can really make one think about how in the future, maybe one day, people can post all these pictures where they look perfect or they look at as their hottest and most idealized self in just the click of the button, while they could look completely different from that. So it's important to realize how over stylized and essentially unrealistic these filters make a person look. And this has actually brought forth a phenomenon that can kind of be referred to as Snapchat dysmorphia, where essentially people are so used to looking at this filtered, completely cartoonish face of theirs that when they look at their actual self in the mirror, they kind of become disgusted or kind of disturbed by it. And this has many seeking to replicate the unrealistic online appearance in real life through dangerous and non approved procedures. So, an example of this, it's something called the Brazilian butt lift. So, um, popular culture has kind of really idealized this curvaceous hourglass body. And so, what a lot of people have been doing is they go to perhaps less reputable surgeons, maybe not in America or not in North America at least, for cheap, and they essentially get fat grafted around the waist from the stomach to create this kind of cartoonish hourglass figure. But this treatment isn't actually approved in the slightest, and when done incorrectly, it can actually cause extreme necrosis around the areas where fat is being injected. So I haven't included a picture here because it's quite graphic, but there's this image that went quite viral of this woman who underwent a Brazilian butt lift, and then essentially all of the tissue around her thighs had necrotized or had basically decayed because of the procedure, all because they wanted to pursue an unrealistic beauty standard. And this is reflected in statistics too, with 55% of plastic surgeons in America reporting seeing a patient who wanted surgery specifically to look better in selfies, and this was in 2017. So, as we can see, the democratization of the beauty industry, whereby anyone could become an influencer, has actually made these pressures even more pervasive in the general public because essentially now these treatments are available to anyone and they've almost become expected or incredibly popular for some. So, looking quickly at how advancements in AI can actually help plastic surgery, um, there's this concept being explored that essentially uses data driven surgical simulation outcomes. And this allows the patient to imagine realistic outcomes for their procedures, as opposed to a more unrealistic standard that can't really be achieved, as seen in these filtered photos. And there's also a concept being explored called prophylactic or preventative aesthetics, where essentially the surgeon can employ AR to detect and market preventative treatments to patients before they may actually realize that there's a supposed flaw in their face. But this really brings forth the question, are these improvements really a good thing if they aid an industry that is promoting something so unhealthy? So, next, I wanted to explore the idea that what if the influencers of the future aren't even really people themselves? So this kind of sounds crazy, but it's already kind of showing up. So there's this influencer called Lil Michaela on Instagram, and she, quote unquote, has over 2 million followers and has actually partnered with many brands to advertise clothing and products. And an example of this I've attached on the left is that recently Little Michaela was, quote unquote, seen at Prada's Autumn Winter 2018 fashion show in Paris, where she was technically at the front row and wearing a digitized version of their clothing. So this kind of brings an ingenious way to advertise for brands, where essentially they can gain more exposure or the same amount as if they were to pay and send free stuff to an influencer, except that they save immense costs because Lil Michaela or a digital influencer isn't real, so they don't have to pay for a flight to fly them out to a fashion show. They don't have to pay for giving them clothing. So it kind of becomes this really interesting, maybe more economical method of influencer endorsement. And it's important to note that Lil Michaela isn't actually using artificial intelligence. It's actually just a computer generated model. However, there are actually AI influencers being developed right now, which I'll show you in the next slide. So Yumi is the first completely AI-operated influencer created by Japanese skincare brand SK2. And as you can see from the video, she's actually she, quote unquote, is actually chatting with whoever the interviewer is quite charmingly, quite naturally, in spite of the robotic voice. And this quote marks the birth of the first fully autonomous AI-driven digital influencer capable of interacting as a human would but with the control brands need and expect. So it's this really interesting idea of essentially employing a machine that's completely at the will of a brand or corporation to kind of replicate the same intimacy and closeness that essentially is what makes an influencer so popular. So this kind of makes one ask, how might influencer culture and beauty advertising evolve if those doing the influencing aren't even human? I mean, you can kind of see the irony in someone without skin being a skincare influencer or saying they love skincare. So this brings me to a bit more of a nebulous topic, and that is transhumanism, which is the movement that affirms the possibility and desirability of fundamentally improving the human condition by developing technology to eliminate aging and enhance human capacity. So if we recall the TED Talk that we listened to at the beginning of the term in this class, we know that steps have already been taken to attempt to transcend biology. And this is kind of in the form of prosthesis, so an artificial limb or organ. But it's important to note that these are more a replacement for faulty or broken biology as opposed to an alternative future where maybe becoming part machine is actually a more attractive option. So, for example, obviously we can't know what will happen in the future, but say this picture has someone shopping for a brand new nose, and maybe in a more less literal sense, this can be through gene therapy and something that can essentially alter your body or maybe your future child's body into their idealized form. And another concept to think about is that how will anti-aging in beauty advertisement exist if aging no longer ceases to exist and we no longer even show physical signs of aging? Or perhaps we're no longer capable of aging in the biological sense because we are completely. So lastly, I wanted to look at some more open-ended questions regarding the future of beauty in the age of the technological singularity. So, first, I think it's very important to note that if or when these procedures exist, such as buying a whole new nose or gene therapy, um, they'll be prohibitively expensive and most likely only available to a very specific hyper elite class. And it's important to note that the makeup of this class will most likely obviously be very rich or very powerful, but also most likely quite ethnically homogeneous. And so this kind of brings forth a slippery slope wherein transhumanism may also lead to a new age of racial or class-based eugenics. So this kind of brings forth the question of, even just because we can, should we? And finally, if one were to imagine a future where essentially we've, say, transcended biology completely, we are completely machine, or perhaps we've just abandoned the corporeal or physical form, will we even be able to process beauty as we know it? So these are just kind of some things to think about because obviously no one will really know what will happen to the future of beauty in the upcoming years. But I think it's important to note that no matter how far into the future we go, um, we can't really escape the injustices of the past without first rectifying them, or otherwise they may kind of interfere with what will hopefully become a more just and equitable future in the coming years. So, thanks so much for taking the time to listen to this. I hope you all have a great rest of the year and that you all stay healthy.